In this video, let's create our first ASP.NET Core web application. The IDE I'm using is Visual Studio 2022 Preview Edition, which is the latest version that supports .NET 9. So in order to follow this course, you have to download .NET 9. At this moment, I have .NET 9 Release Candidate 1. By the time you follow this course, .NET 9 might have been already officially released. So just download the latest .NET 9 and the latest Visual Studio. Okay, so when it's officially released, you don't have to use the preview Visual Studio. You can use Visual Studio. At this moment, I have to use Visual Studio 2022 Preview Edition in order to actually use .NET 9. Okay, so let's go to File and then go to New and then click on Project. And when you first open up Visual Studio 2022, let's close this. Let's try to open up it again. It will show a different interface. Looks like this. Okay, so if we scroll down here, don't worry about this most recent part. This is the list of applications that you created in the past. So just pay attention to the right-hand side. You can click on this, create a new project, or you can go with continue without code. So if you go with continue without code, you can go to the file menu and still create a new project. In this video, let's use create a new project right here, and then here you can choose C#. Choose C# and you can choose web. You don't have to use this. If you just use the filter here, you can do ASP.NET Core. This will give you a list of application templates, project templates that have ASP.NET Core in their names. So let's scroll down and look at this ASP.NET Core empty project template. So this is the project template we're going to use in this video. Other templates have a lot of different things going on. This template is the simplest one we can use, which is good for learning everything from scratch. Once you know how to work with an empty ASP.NET Core application, you can use other templates and everything will make sense for you. So let's work with the empty template for now. So choose this one and click on next. And then here we have project name, location, and solution. So we can call this project a web app, and then the solution here we can call it my first app, for example, and then click on the next. Now the framework here, you can choose .NET 9. You should choose .NET 9. Again, by the time you use it, it might be already released. So it's going to just show .NET 9 without this preview in the bracket. So choose this and then uncheck this HTTPS. We are going to configure our application to use HTTPS later. For now, we don't need to worry about HTTPS. Enable container support. Do not check this. We're not going to talk about container, at least in this video. And then keep this unchecked and click on the create. Here we are creating the project inside the solution. All right, if this is the first time you use Visual Studio to create a web application, let's talk about this. We have the solution and we have the project under it. So remember, this is the project name that I just give it, and this is the solution name, my first web app. So a solution can contain either 0 project or 1 project or more than 1 project. Here in the solution, we have just 1 project. But if you go to solution here and click on add, you can add a new project in it, and then it will show 2 projects under the solution. Anyways, I just want to show you that the hierarchy. A solution can contain projects. Currently, we only have this web application, 1 single project. Let's open this up, and you can see this program.cs file. So this program.cs file is the same as a console application, right? So a web application now looks like a console application. And in fact, it is actually a console application, but it's just a special type of console application. Let's go to program.cs file. Open it up and you can see 4 lines of code. Before I explain what these 4 lines of code do, let's review our diagram that we talked about in the previous video when we talk about ASP.NET Core anatomy. So let's scroll down to this overview diagram here. You can see that for a web application, we have a Castro server, and then we have the web application right here. So the Castro server listens for requests to come and forward that request. Of course, it converts the request to forward that object to the web application. The web application uses the middleware pipeline here, process the request, and generates the response. Pass back to the Castro server. The Castro server forward that response to the browser for display. So this is the overview structure. And I want you to pay attention. We have this Castro server and we have this. Now let's go back to our Visual Studio here. The first line of code actually sets up and create the Castro server. And that's what the first line does. Of course, it generates this builder object. And then when the builder object calls the build method, which is the second line, if you hover the mouse over it, you can see that it actually creates or returns this web application instance. So this app object here is the web application. So now you know that this one sets up and creates the Castro server, which corresponds to the Castro server right here. And then the second line generates an instance of the web application, which corresponds to this rectangle right here. Now the third line is actually a middleware pipeline component. Right, we're going to talk about this later, but this one corresponds to the middleware pipeline component, which corresponds to this part, this middleware pipeline right here. And in this case, we only have one middleware component. Although in the diagram we have several, but in here we only see one, because this is the simplest web application you can create. And then we have this app.run. Obviously, this runs the web application as well as it starts the Castro server. Right? It runs the web application in an infinite loop, makes the Castro server listens to the incoming HTTP request. As soon as it receives the incoming request, it's going to convert that request to the HTTP context object, which we're going to cover in perhaps the next video, at least in the future videos. And then that HTTP context object is going to be passed into the middleware pipeline component. Right? In here, we have only one component. We're not using that HTTP context yet, but in the future videos, we're going to cover that. It is very important to notice that these 4 lines of code are not executed in sequence. The middleware component is only configured there, but it's only executed when the Castro server receives a request. So it doesn't actually run in sequence. And you can see that with these 4 different lines of code. We're running our server. We're waiting for the request to come in. We process the request, which simply just returns hello world. And then it's going to come back, listen to that HTTP request to come in again. So let's actually run this application and see how it works. All right, you can see that the browser started, displays hello world in the browser. Now it also starts this console app, and this proves that it is actually console app, but it tells you that it's now listening on this domain and this port, and it's waiting for a request to come in. Let me enlarge the font size. You can see that it's listening to localhost 5276 and waiting for the request to come in. Once the request comes in to the root directory, it basically just spit out a string, hello world with exclamation mark. And then it comes back to listen to the port again. So this is how it works. Now, obviously, we talked about a lot of different things in our anatomy here: routing, authentication, authorization, model binding, model validation, and how we handle this request. This is the endpoint handler here, different types of endpoint handlers, and then it produced results. In our first application here, it doesn't reflect all of that because it's the simplest application you can have, right? But at least it shows a simple routing mechanism here. It maps the root to this function, right? This is a Lambda expression that represents a delegate to a function. And this function simply just returns a string here. So it shows the routing mechanism, which is part of the routing middleware. Although it doesn't show the routing middleware, it actually by default wraps this code with a routing middleware. And then you can see we have this endpoint handler, right? And this is the minimal API type of endpoint handler here. Right? We're going to talk about all of this. If it doesn't actually make sense to you right now, you probably don't know what a minimal API if you haven't used ASP.NET Core before, but I'm just providing you with the information, and we're going to dive deep into each one of this in the future videos or future sections. And then it produced results. In this case, it produced a string results. So you can see out of all those features, we can see this has one middleware component. We can see a basic routing mechanism that maps root to this Lambda expression, which is this endpoint, right? And then you can see this endpoint handler here that simply returns a string, and then you can see it basically produces a string result and put it into the HTTP response. So it covers all of those features or parts in our diagram right here. Now, between the builder and the build, we can actually configure the Castro server as well as the web application, right? So for example, you can say builder.webhost. Here you can configure some parts of Castro server, or you can say builder.environment. You can configure the environment of the application, and you can say builder.services. Now you can add services to the application, which we're going to talk about in the future as well. And you can use configuration to configure the application as well. So all of these we're going to talk about in the future. In this video, we have seen the basic structure of a web application that starts a Castro server, builds a web application, add a middleware pipeline component, maps from the root to a function, endpoint handler, and it listens infinitely to a specific port for more requests to come. So I would like you to go back and familiarize yourself with this diagram and map this to this simple 4 lines of code. And that's everything I want to cover in this video. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next one.